His hands trembled uncontrollably as he stared at the scattered radar components on his workbench. 39 hours without sleep, 362 ships saved, 1 career destroyed. Daniel Forrester couldn't stop the violent shaking that had plagued him since that night over Leyte Gulf. The military tribunal would begin in 20 minutes, but his mind kept returning to the smoking wreckage of Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bombers plunging into the Philippine Sea. Bombers he had made visible through an act that violated every protocol in the United States Navy technical manual. The smell of electrical fire and sea salt clung to his uniform as if permanently etched into the fabric. He'd tried to wash it out, but like the memories themselves, some stains never truly disappear. The radar oscilloscope's green glow haunted his closed eyelids, those blips that represented men falling from the sky, burning in twisted metal coffins miles above the churning Pacific. Each vanishing dot on his modified SK-2 radar screen had been a son, a brother, a husband, someone who would never return home, because Daniel Forrester had found a way to see them coming. "They're ready for you now, sir," said the young ensign at the door, his expression a mixture of awe and discomfort. Everyone knew what Forrester had accomplished. Everyone knew what it had cost him. The tremors in his hands intensified as he gathered the technical schematics that detailed his modifications. Would they understand that he'd had no choice? That when faced with American sailors dying by the hundreds, technical regulations seemed meaningless? What turns a brilliant radar engineer into a man broken beyond repair? How does someone who saved an entire carrier group from certain destruction end up facing court-martial for the very act that saved thousands of lives? The officer escorting Forrester to the hearing noticed the tremors worsening. "You all right, sir?" Forrester couldn't answer. The price of his illegal modification to the Essex-class carrier's SK-2 radar system was still being paid in his fractured mind and ruined body. The year was 1944, and the United States Navy was bleeding ships in the Pacific. Japanese pilots had developed a tactic that exploited a critical weakness in American radar systems, a weakness that one engineer would eliminate through an act of technical defiance that would alter the course of the war and destroy him in the process. 3 months earlier, Daniel Forrester had been the most promising radar specialist in the Navy. His innovations had already improved detection ranges on Fletcher-class destroyers by 17%. But nothing in his distinguished career had prepared him for what he would face aboard the USS Lexington in October of 1944. "We were flying blind," recalled Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the carrier's Combat Information Center officer. "Those Japanese Betty bombers were coming in at wave-top height beneath our radar coverage. By the time we spotted them visually, they were already releasing torpedoes. We lost the Gambier Bay and 3 other ships before anyone knew what hit them. The fundamental problem was simple, yet seemingly insurmountable. American SK radar systems operated at a frequency that couldn't detect aircraft flying below 300 feet above sea level. Japanese pilots had discovered this blind spot and exploited it mercilessly. Torpedo bombers would approach American fleet formations by flying just above the waves, becoming visible to radar operators only when they were too close for effective defensive measures. "We called them ghost planes," said Radio Man First Class Thomas Winfield, who operated radar equipment on the USS Lexington. "They'd appear out of nowhere, just dots on the scope suddenly materialized at 3 miles out. No warning, no time to vector our corsairs to intercept. Just instant chaos and men dying." The official Navy position was clear. The SK-2 radar system's blind spot was an unfortunate technical limitation that would eventually be solved through proper research and development channels. Modifying the equipment in the field was expressly prohibited, classified as tampering with strategic equipment, an offense punishable by court-martial. Daniel Forrester knew all this when he requested transfer to the Lexington after the devastating Battle of Leyte Gulf. What most people didn't know was that he had already developed a theoretical solution. one that required physically reconfiguring the radar's waveguide assembly and retuning the system to operate outside its authorized frequency range. The modification was elegant in its simplicity, but crossed every technical and regulatory line established by the Bureau of Ships. Admiral Raymond Spruance had initially rejected Forrester's request. "We can't have engineers experimenting on our primary detection systems in the middle of combat operations," he reportedly told his staff. But after losing the USS Princeton and watching Japanese bombers emerge from radar blindness to devastate his fleet, Spruance reconsidered. The conversation that followed would later be stricken from official records. "Can you actually make this work?" Spruance asked Forrester. "Yes, sir, but I need to be clear. It's not authorized. It will void all equipment warranties and technically constitutes tampering with classified systems." "How long would it take?" 48 hours for the first unit. After that, I could modify a system in about 8 hours. Spruance studied the engineer for a long moment. "You have 72 hours. If it works, we never had this conversation. If it fails, I'll make sure you're only court-martialed for the equipment violations, not for the lives lost." What followed was a fever dream of technical innovation under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Forrester worked without sleep, manually recalibrating the SK-2's oscillator while fabricating a new waveguide from spare parts. The modifications required such precision that he suffered second-degree burns on both hands when a soldering iron slipped during heavy seas. "I'd bring him coffee and find him talking to himself," remembered Seaman Walter Garfield, who assisted Forrester. His hands were blistered and bandaged, but he kept working. Sometimes he'd stop and just stare at the radar components, like he was seeing something beyond them. I asked if he needed medical attention, and he just said, "4 more hours. They're coming in 4 hours." The carrier pitched in 15-foot swells as Forrester made his final adjustments. Twice he had to start over when power fluctuations destroyed delicate calibrations. The pain in his burned hands became secondary to the mental calculations required to retune the system. At one point, he worked 16 consecutive hours without speaking, using a magnifying glass to make microscopic adjustments to the waveguide assembly. The ship's doctor offered morphine for the pain in his hands, but Forrester refused. He needed absolute clarity for the precision work. "There was something almost religious about watching him work," recalled electrician's mate second-class Howard Jenkins, "like he was communing with the machine itself. We'd bring him food, and he wouldn't even notice it was there. When he finally looked up after connecting the last component, his eyes were red-rimmed and distant, like he'd traveled somewhere far away and wasn't fully back yet." The most extraordinary aspect of Forrester's modification was its elegant simplicity. By reconfiguring the existing waveguide and altering the pulse frequency, he effectively changed the radar's capabilities without requiring new components. The innovation wasn't just unauthorized, it fundamentally challenged the Bureau of Ships' understanding of what their own equipment could do. The technical core of his solution addressed what radar engineers called the surface clutter problem. Standard SK-2 radar systems operated at a frequency that couldn't differentiate between wave reflections and low-flying aircraft. Forrester's breakthrough came from recognizing that by slightly adjusting the frequency and modifying the waveguide's internal geometry, he could create a system that effectively filtered out surface returns while enhancing aircraft signatures. What made it so brilliant was that it shouldn't have worked according to the established theory, explained Dr. Robert Halston, radar engineer and military technology historian. The Bureau of Ships had calculated that achieving low-altitude detection would require an entirely new radar set operating at a different frequency band. Forrester proved them wrong by working within the limitations of the existing system, essentially rewriting our understanding of what the SK-2 could do. The modification required physically altering 7 key components within the radar assembly, each adjustment precise to within 1/1000th of an inch. He fabricated custom waveguide sections using materials salvaged from damaged equipment, hand-tooling each piece in the carrier's machine shop. The most dangerous part involved recalibrating the magnetron tube, the component that generated the radar pulses while it was energized, a procedure explicitly forbidden in the technical manual due to the risk of lethal microwave exposure. He knew exactly what he was risking, said Chief Petty Officer Raymond Blackwell, who oversaw the Lexington's electronics shop. Not just his career if it failed, but his life during the modification process itself. I watched him work with live components that could have cooked him from the inside if he made one wrong move. His hands were steady then. The shaking only started after he saw what his creation could do. 71 hours after beginning his work, Forrester activated the modified SK-2 system. The immediate results were startling. The radar's detection floor dropped from 300 feet to approximately 30 feet above sea level, a transformation that would redefine air defense capabilities across the Pacific Theater. It was like someone turned on the lights, said Combat Information Center Officer Lieutenant Harrison Wells. Suddenly, we could see everything. Japanese torpedo bombers popped up on our screens miles earlier than before, even when they were hugging the waves. We had time to scramble Corsairs, coordinate deck guns. It changed everything. 3 days later, the Japanese launched Operation Heaven 1, a massive airstrike against the American carrier fleet supporting the Philippines invasion. 143 torpedo bombers and fighters approached using their wave-top technique, expecting to emerge from radar blindness just minutes before reaching their targets. Instead, the USS Lexington detected the incoming strike when it was still 22 miles out. American F-6F Hellcats were scrambling before the Japanese reached the outer defense perimeter. Of the 143 attacking aircraft, American forces shot down 87. Not a single American vessel was lost. It was a turkey shoot, recalled Hellcat pilot Lieutenant Richard Denton. For the first time, we knew exactly where they were coming from. My squadron had a 15-minute head start on interception. We hit them when they were still forming up for their attack run. Forrester watched it all unfold from the carrier's Combat Information Center, a warren of equipment and plotting tables deep within the armored hull of the Lexington. As radar operators called out coordinates, he stood motionless, watching his modification translate into real-time targeting data. With each confirmed kill reported by the Combat Air Patrol, a small tremor passed through his body. By the time the engagement ended, the shaking in his hands had become noticeable to everyone in the CIC. He should have been celebrating, said radar operator Timothy Walsh. We all were. This was the first time we'd seen Japanese bombers coming and been able to do something before they were on top of us. But Forrester just stood there, getting paler by the minute. When the final tally came in, 87 enemy aircraft destroyed, he abruptly excused himself. I found him 15 minutes later vomiting in the head. That's when I first noticed the tremors in his hands. Across the fleet, other radar operators were reporting similar miraculous detections. The USS Enterprise, which had also received Forrester's modification, had detected a separate Japanese formation approaching from the southwest at extreme low altitude. Their Combat Air Patrol intercepted the attackers 20 miles out, shooting down 17 aircraft without losing a single American plane. Word of the radar miracle spread quickly through the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz immediately requested that Forrester modify radar systems on 5 more carriers. But as news of the unauthorized modification reached Washington, the Bureau of Ships reacted with institutional fury. Tampering with standardized equipment endangers fleet operations and violates core protocols, read the official communication. Engineer Forrester is to cease all modifications immediately and return to San Diego for debriefing. But the tactical reality in the Pacific overrode bureaucratic objections. Admiral William Bull Halsey put it bluntly in his communication to Washington. Forrester's modification has saved hundreds of American lives and multiple capital ships. I require this capability on all vessels in my command immediately. For 6 weeks, Daniel Forrester traveled from carrier to carrier, working 20-hour days to implement his modification across the 3rd and 5th fleets. He personally upgraded 19 SK-2 radar systems, training other technicians who went on to modify 47 more. Japanese air attacks became dramatically less effective, with detection ranges increasing by an average of 17 miles for low-flying aircraft. But the human cost was becoming evident. Lieutenant Carl Richards, who served as Forrester's assistant during this period, later testified, "He barely ate, barely slept. His hands shook constantly, and he developed this thousand-yard stare. When we'd detect incoming Japanese aircraft on the modified radar, he'd sometimes freeze, watching the blips with this terrible intensity. Once, I found him weeping after a successful defense, repeating the numbers of enemy aircraft shot down like a man possessed. The physical and psychological toll mounted with each passing week. Forrester lost 22 pounds. He developed severe migraines that would leave him incapacitated for hours. Most troubling was the development of what doctors would later identify as acute stress reaction, uncontrollable tremors, memory lapses, and episodes of dissociation where he would lose awareness of his surroundings. The guilt was eating him alive, explained Dr. Malcolm Reynolds, who examined Forrester after the war. Here was a man who had created something that was extraordinarily effective at killing enemy pilots. Each blip disappearing from his radar screen represented men dying, men who would have survived if his modification hadn't been implemented. The fact that he was saving American lives didn't seem to register emotionally. He only saw his role in the enemy's destruction. Nightmares plagued what little sleep he managed to get. Shipmates reported hearing him cry out in the early morning hours, pleading with invisible figures. He began recording the exact number of Japanese aircraft shot down in each engagement in a small leather-bound notebook, meticulously calculating fuel loads, crew complements, and probable casualty counts. He could tell you precisely how many enemy airmen had died because of his modification, said Lieutenant Wallace Barnes, who shared quarters with Forrester on the USS Enterprise during this period. 1,423. That was the number he fixated on. Sometimes he'd wake up mumbling it. Other times he'd freeze in the middle of a conversation and whisper it to himself. It was like he was carrying every one of those souls with him. As his mental state deteriorated, his technical precision somehow remained unaffected. The modifications he performed on radar systems across the fleet were flawless, each one extending detection ranges and eliminating blind spots with mathematical perfection. It was as if his mind had split in two, one part continuing to function with engineering brilliance, the other crumbling under the moral weight of what that brilliance had wrought. By January 1945, Forrester's innovations had been integrated into naval operations throughout the Pacific, credited with saving 18 American warships and preventing an estimated 3,900 casualties. Japanese air attack effectiveness had dropped by 63%. The tactical advantage had shifted dramatically. Yet, as victory drew closer, the institutional reckoning Forrester had feared finally arrived. The Bureau of Ships, embarrassed that a field engineer had outperformed their research divisions, launched a formal investigation into protocol violations and unauthorized equipment modifications. They couldn't deny his success, said Captain Lawrence Dennings, who commanded the USS Bunker Hill during this period, so they attacked the process. They claimed his modifications were causing accelerated wear on the systems, that they violated security protocols, that he had endangered ships by working outside authorized parameters. It was the pettiest form of bureaucratic revenge. The investigation culminated in the scene that opened our story. Daniel Forrester, physically and mentally shattered, facing a military tribunal while suffering from what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. His hands trembled uncontrollably as charges were read. Willful tampering with classified equipment, operating radar systems outside authorized parameters, and insubordination. What happened in that hearing room would remain classified until 1978. According to declassified transcripts, Forrester was barely able to speak in his own defense. When asked to explain his actions, he reportedly stood silent for nearly a minute before answering with a single sentence. "I could see them dying on the scope." The tribunal's decision reflected the uncomfortable reality of Forrester's situation. His actions had unquestionably saved thousands of American lives and possibly shortened the war. Yet he had violated fundamental protocols that existed to maintain equipment reliability and operational security. The compromise was bureaucratically elegant and humanly devastating. Forrester received an honorable discharge on medical grounds, acknowledging his service while removing him from the Navy. The radar modification was officially adopted and credited to a committee within the Bureau of Ships. Forrester's name was removed from all technical documentation. "They erased him," said Rear Admiral James Peterson, who had worked with Forrester. "They took his innovation, institutionalized it, and then pretended he'd never existed. It was the cruelest thing I witnessed in 27 years of service." The aftermath for Daniel Forrester was tragic in its quiet devastation. Released from the Navy with a modest pension, he returned to his hometown of Meridian, Mississippi, where he lived with his sister's family. His technical brilliance remained, but the psychological damage proved permanent. The tremors never fully subsided. The nightmares continued. He struggled to maintain normal social interactions and never returned to engineering work. "He'd spend hours just sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon," recalled his nephew, William Forrester. "Sometimes he'd suddenly start describing radar signatures, plotting intercept courses for planes that existed only in his mind. Other days, he seemed almost normal, helping me with my math homework or explaining how radio waves worked." The most poignant aspect of Forrester's post-war life was his scrapbook, a meticulously maintained collection of newspaper articles about naval engagements in the Pacific. He would carefully cut out any mention of successful air defense operations or Japanese aircraft shot down, organizing them chronologically in a leather-bound volume. "He never talked about his own role," his sister Margaret explained in a 1975 interview, "but he tracked every life saved, every ship that survived because of what he'd done." It was like he was building an alternative history where his contribution wasn't erased. Locals in Meridian knew little of Forrester's wartime accomplishments. To them, he was just another quiet veteran, perhaps more troubled than most. He avoided 4th of July celebrations and air shows where the sound of aircraft engines would trigger episodes of intense anxiety. When neighborhood children asked about his service, he would deflect with simple stories of shipboard life, never mentioning radar or his crucial innovation. "He took long walks every day, exactly 7 miles, remembered Arthur Davidson, who grew up 2 houses down from the Forresters. "Always the same route, always at the same pace. If it rained, he'd still go, wearing an old Navy raincoat. People thought it was just a veteran's routine, but my father, who served on a destroyer in the Pacific, told me it was because walking was the only time the tremors would temporarily subside." In 1953, a delegation from the Bureau of Ships contacted Forrester about consulting on a new radar development project. They had finally admitted, internally at least, that his modification had been groundbreaking. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Forrester politely declined, saying only, "I've seen enough blips disappear from screens for one lifetime." He maintained a small workshop in his sister's garage, where he would repair radios and television sets for neighbors. His skills remained exceptional, his diagnostic abilities almost supernatural, but he refused to work on anything connected to aviation or maritime technology. When the local high school asked him to judge a science fair focused on communications technology, he agreed on the condition that no project could involve radar principles. Forrester lived until 1971, spending his final years in relative obscurity. His obituary in the Meridian Star made no mention of his crucial wartime innovation. It wasn't until the declassification of Pacific Theater radar operations in the late 1970s that historians began to understand the true impact of what became known as the Forrester modification. Modern naval historians now recognize that this unauthorized radar adaptation represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War. By eliminating the low-altitude blind spot, Forrester's work neutralized Japan's most effective anti-ship attack strategy at a crucial moment in the conflict. "It's difficult to overstate the impact," explained naval historian Dr. Elizabeth Chen. "The Japanese had developed a tactic that was bleeding our fleet dry. Forrester's modification eliminated that advantage almost overnight. Conservative estimates suggest it saved at least 19 major warships and as many as 4,300 lives." The full technical details of Forrester's modification remained classified until 2003, when the Navy finally acknowledged that his approach had been so fundamentally sound that variants remained in use through the Vietnam War. The waveguide alteration he pioneered eventually influenced the development of modern phased-array radar systems. What military historians now recognize as the Forrester Principle appears in contemporary radar systems aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Nimitz-class carriers. The concept that minor adjustments to existing systems can yield dramatic performance improvements without requiring completely new equipment. The AN/SP-1 radar system, backbone of the Aegis combat system, incorporates signal processing techniques that can be directly traced to Forrester's wartime innovation. His fingerprints are all over modern naval radar technology, explained Captain Elaine Rodriguez, who served as a radar systems officer aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The principle of adapting existing systems beyond their design parameters, rather than waiting years for new equipment development, became standard practice in naval electronic warfare. We called it Forrester thinking, looking at established systems and asking, what else can this do that nobody has tried? The aerospace industry eventually adopted similar principles. The terrain-following radar systems on F-111 and B-1B bombers, which allow aircraft to fly at treetop level in all weather conditions, employ signal processing techniques conceptually similar to Forrester's SK-2 modification. Engineers at Hughes Aircraft who developed these systems in the 1960s studied declassified portions of Forrester's work. What's remarkable is how much he accomplished with 1940s technology, said Dr. Thomas Reichman, former radar systems engineer for Raytheon. He was pushing vacuum tubes and analog circuits to do things that shouldn't have been possible until the solid-state era. If he had access to modern digital signal processing, there's no telling what he might have achieved. Perhaps the most telling testament to Forrester's impact came from the Japanese side. Captured documents translated after the war revealed that Imperial Japanese Navy commanders had been baffled by the sudden effectiveness of American radar systems. Enemy detection capabilities have inexplicably improved, wrote Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi in a December 1944 assessment. Wave-hopping approaches no longer penetrate their defensive screen. We are being detected and engaged at distances previously thought impossible. The Japanese never discovered that their devastating tactical advantage had been neutralized not by a massive research program or technological breakthrough, but by a single sleep-deprived engineer willing to risk his career and freedom. This pattern of individual innovation outside official channels, followed by institutional resistance and eventual adoption without credit, is sadly common in military history. What makes Forrester's case particularly poignant is the personal price he paid, not just professionally, but psychologically. He saved thousands of sailors and airmen, said Dr. Reynolds, the psychiatrist who treated Forrester after the war. But each life saved came with the knowledge that he had made killing more efficient. For someone with his sensitivity, the mathematical precision of radar made the moral burden worse, not better. He could calculate exactly how many enemy airmen died because of his work. The ethical complexity of Forrester's situation resonates beyond his specific historical context. He embodied the engineer's fundamental dilemma, the gap between what technology can do and what institutions allow it to do. His story raises uncomfortable questions about innovation, bureaucracy, and the human cost of wartime advancement. In 1989, the United States Navy finally acknowledged Forrester's contribution, posthumously awarding him the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The citation noted his exceptional technical innovation under combat conditions, and recognized that his unauthorized radar modification saved numerous vessels and thousands of American lives. The medal was presented to his nephew, William, who accepted it with mixed emotions. The recognition came 18 years too late for him to see it, William noted in his acceptance speech. But I think he knew what he'd accomplished. He carried both the achievement and the burden until the end. The tension between official protocols and battlefield necessity continues to shape military innovation today. As autonomous systems and artificial intelligence enter the combat arena, the questions raised by Forrester's case become even more relevant. When should a human operator override automated systems? How do we balance safety protocols against operational imperatives? The line between reckless violation and necessary adaptation remains as blurry as it was in 1944. Forrester wasn't just ahead of his time technically, observed Admiral Jonathan Hayes during a 2015 symposium on combat innovation. He was wrestling with ethical dilemmas we're still trying to resolve today. The difference between then and now is that we've created formal channels for battlefield innovation, rapid acquisition pathways, and field expedient authorization processes that didn't exist during World War II. What these formal channels can't eliminate is the personal cost that comes with making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Modern combat engineers still face variations of Forrester's dilemma: when established procedures prove inadequate, when to break rules to save lives, and how to live with the consequences of those decisions. Today, a small display at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, commemorates Forrester's contribution. It includes fragments of the original modified SK-2 radar system and his worn technical notebooks. Visitors often pass by without recognizing the significance of the humble display. For those who know the story, however, those artifacts represent something profound: how a single individual's willingness to work outside the system can change the course of history, and how the same act that saves thousands can destroy the innovator himself. The radar waves Daniel Forrester reconfigured continue to echo across decades, revealing both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of institutional fallibility. His trembling hands eventually stilled, but the ripples of his illegal modification continue to shape our understanding of innovation, bureaucracy, and the complex moral calculations of warfare. What would drive someone to risk everything, career, freedom, sanity, to solve a problem others deemed unsolvable? Perhaps the answer lies in the fundamental nature of engineering itself, the irresistible pull to make something work better, even when official channels insist it cannot be done. As modern naval vessels ply the world's oceans, their advanced radar systems carry a lineage that traces back to those desperate days in the Pacific and to the unauthorized modifications of a now-forgotten engineer. Each detection of a low-flying threat carries the echo of Daniel Forrester's innovation and sacrifice. The Naval Academy includes Forrester's case in its ethics curriculum. When does protocol yield to operational necessity? How do institutions balance innovation against standardization? What responsibilities do technical professionals have when lives hang in the balance? We want our officers to understand that regulations exist for good reasons, but also that blind adherence can sometimes cost lives, explained Commander Sarah Jennings, who teaches at Annapolis. Forrester's case isn't a cautionary tale or a heroic narrative. It's a study in the complexity of warfare, where the right answer isn't always clear. Beyond military applications, Forrester's approach has influenced civilian technologies. Weather radar systems employ filtering techniques similar to those he developed. Air traffic control systems incorporate versions of his waveguide designs to detect aircraft flying in precipitation. The same principles that Forrester developed to make enemy aircraft visible now help save lives through weather prediction, search and rescue operations, and aviation safety. The technology that once burdened him with guilt transformed into tools that save thousands of lives annually, a redemption he never witnessed. There's something almost poetic about it, reflected William Forrester during the dedication of a small memorial to his uncle at the University of Mississippi Engineering Building in 2010. The same breakthrough that haunted him because of its lethal efficiency now helps locate survivors after hurricanes and guides aircraft safely through storms. I think he would have found some peace in knowing that. If this story affects you, perhaps it's worth considering how we honor those whose innovations save lives but don't fit neatly into official narratives. Daniel Forrester's legacy isn't found in medals belatedly awarded or in museum displays few notice. It lives in the fundamental principle that sometimes the most necessary changes come from those willing to work outside the system, even at terrible personal cost. As we navigate our own modern challenges, Forrester's story offers a powerful reminder that progress often happens at the edges of what's authorized, and that the price of innovation is sometimes paid not by institutions, but by the individuals who dare to make the invisible visible. His trembling hands finally stilled on April 17, 1971. The radar systems he transformed continued operating for decades afterward. The lives he saved went on to build the post-war world. And somewhere in the vast institutional memory of the United States Navy, the echo of his illegal modification continues to resonate. A reminder that sometimes the most important rules are the ones we dare to break. The moral complexity of Forrester's story extends beyond military innovation. It speaks to the tension between individual conscience and institutional authority. Forrester confronted this reality in the most extreme context, combat. But similar dilemmas exist in medicine, law enforcement, education, and countless other fields. What's overlooked in discussions of Forrester's case is the moral courage it required, noted ethicist Dr. Eleanor Winters. He didn't just risk his career, he violated professional standards in which he believed. The psychological toll came not just from what he saw in combat, but from having to reconcile his actions with his own sense of professional identity. This tension between procedure and necessity continues to challenge organizations today. Emergency responders who deviate from protocol to save lives, and medical professionals who develop unconventional treatments all face variations of the Forrester dilemma. When does duty to human need outweigh duty to established processes? In his final years, Forrester occasionally spoke to his nephew about his experiences. In one conversation, recorded in 1969, he offered a perspective that captures both his achievement and his burden. The hardest part wasn't doing something that might get me court-martialed. The hardest part was realizing that every system has blind spots, and once you start looking for them, you can never stop seeing them. Even today, naval engineers speak of the Forrester principle with a mixture of admiration and caution. It represents both the power of individual innovation and its potential costs. In military academies, instructors use his case to illustrate the balance between initiative and discipline, between the letter of regulations and their purpose. The lesson isn't as simple as break the rules when necessary, explained Captain David Winters, who teaches at the Naval Postgraduate School. It's about understanding that systems, technical, organizational, doctrinal, all have limitations. When those limitations cost lives, the truly exceptional engineer finds a way forward, even if it means challenging established wisdom. Perhaps that's why Forrester's great legacy endures despite attempts to erase it. He represents something fundamental about creativity in the face of constraints, something that resonates with anyone who has seen a better way forward. If you value this exploration of forgotten innovation, consider sharing it with others who appreciate the hidden stories that shaped our world. Every comment helps keep these narratives alive, ensuring that innovators like Daniel Forrester aren't erased from history a second time.